Good morning, Pelham Road. Rise and shine. Get out of bed, sleepyheads. Remember, if you want some good poetry, insightful reading, brainpickings.org. Always something interesting over there. Now, because I record these earlier, and I'm recording these a week before you will see them. I have no idea if you had much of a reaction to my announcement yesterday. I know there's some of you who really love this show, and I imagine you reached out to me after you heard that we might be canceling, or we will be canceling at the end of the month. Trust me, we're thinking about what to do next. There'll be something. It won't be totally void, okay? I just need to sleep later, okay? Well, I'm not doing these early in the morning anyway. All right, so where were we yesterday? Let me find my glasses. All right. Well, after Jesus preaches his sermon from Luke, or in Luke, preaching it from Isaiah 61, like I said, the people didn't have any negative reaction to him calling for a year of Jubilee. That didn't seem to bother them at all. It's when he sits down in the pew and he starts talking that they begin to have some issues. One of the first rules of interpretation, of interpreting ancient texts, it is just a good rule for you to learn, is this: if it does not mean something to the original hearers, how can it mean anything to us? In other words, it has to mean something to the ones who heard it first. And such a saying demands that we consider the context. And in this case, we have to consider two contexts. The first is between Jesus and those who actually heard him in the synagogue. That's one. The second context is Luke and his particular readers. So we have to consider both of these as we go forward. Because bear this in mind, and I try to remind people of this all the time, and I know it's not a pleasant thing to know or to be reminded of, but the Bible was not written for hybrid car driving Americans in 2020, okay? That was not the intended audience. There's an original audience. That was the first audience. So all spoke well of it. They were amazed. That's the line from Luke. The gracious words that came from his mouth, and they said, "Is this not Joseph's son?" I mean, that was their response. Now, granted, he had hardly preached. He basically read Isaiah 61, but they liked it. That's the point. They really liked it. The original hearers, the ones that Jesus was with, they liked that. Now, Luke's audience, they were Greek. They probably didn't know a lot about the Jewish writing prophets. It might have seemed to them like a History Channel documentary that they were reading or hearing about. But no one is outraged at this point. That's sort of my point. Nobody's outraged at this moment. And Jesus is he's fulfilling this preaching duties, this prophetic role. He says the Spirit of the Lord is upon him. And so the early reviews from the congregation, it's a hit. Jesus takes his seat, and that's where the tires get a little loose. I imagine that Jesus is sort of sitting back. He's pushed himself into the third row or so. And then he speaks again. And I don't know why he speaks, but he speaks, and it made the news. Somebody recorded it. "Doubtless you will quote to me this proverb, 'Doctor, cure yourself.' And you will say to me, 'Why don't you do here what you did over in Capernaum?' And truly I tell you, there is no prophet that is accepted in the prophet's hometown." And he's considering himself the prophet. Now, none of these proverbs are the greatest hits, okay? They're buried deep in the text. But they haunted Jesus. Jesus had remembered them from his education, because all of them are about abandonment. They're about how people are fickle. Without miracles, Jesus senses that the crowd will move on to another person. Jesus understands full well what he is saying. You're going to reject me one day. That's what he's trying to say to them. You are going to reject me because I am more bitter than I am sweet. You're going to tell me, heal yourself. Now, the people sitting in the room when he says these words, they likely don't really know what to make of this. Still listening, they hear these words, but I'm afraid that probably sounded a little bit like nonsense to the original hearers in the room. And to those that Luke is writing to, I don't think that they really thought much of that. But then something else happens. Jesus moves from talking about how he feels like they're going to abandon them to something that is going to really offend them. The truth is, he tells them this, there were many widows in Israel in the time of Elijah, when heaven was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, and there was a severe famine all over the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them except a widow at Sidon, which is another country. And then he says the same thing about lepers and how Israel was eaten up with leprosy, and yet God sent Elijah to Syria to heal someone. So Jesus tells two stories here that the Hebrews that are in the synagogue likely knew by heart. Two stories that say loudly and really clearly that the Hebrews don't own God, that God cannot be owned. In fact, God often chooses to do his best work with others. Now, tomorrow, we're going to get to the response of the original hearers in Jesus' audience. Tomorrow, we're going to concentrate more on them. But today, let's concern ourselves with Luke's readers and how they're hearing this. Luke, being the only non-Jew to be included in the New Testament, circulated his gospel among the Gentiles. So, when they read that God's been at work at Sidon, and God has been working in Syria, God's already worked with the outsiders, these people are lighting up. They are excited because they're hearing something for the first time. They thought they were outsiders, but now they're hearing about how this God has always been working with outsiders. In fact, they never were outsiders, is probably what's dawning on them. Luke's gospel then, and even now, has always embraced those that have no status. I mean, that's who hears this gospel the loudest. The people that are on the outside. The lady of the evening. The one born on the wrong side of the tracks. The immigrant who is fleeing their country for safety. The enslaved African American. Or, if you want to put it the way Isaiah put it, the captives separated from their family, the poor, the oppressed. I imagine Luke's gospel being read among the Gentile immigrants sitting around a campfire. That's the way I imagine this story being told. They're sitting around the campfire, and Luke's being read to them, and they're reading this passage about how God is at work in Syria and with other people who are not Jewish. People who are poor, people who are oppressed, people who are on the outside. And I imagine they're sitting around the campfire, and one of them looks up and says, oh, man, all of these years I thought that was their God. And his friend answers, yeah, I guess that's what they wanted us to think, that it was their God. So we'd be afraid and think that they were maybe better than us. And then the first guy says, well, now we learned. God doesn't have favorites. He loves us too. Indeed, he does. That's a good place to start. Tomorrow, we'll get back to Jesus' hometown and what those original hearers in the synagogue were feeling. See you then.